Welcome to this video on the World of Future Darkness, the 5,000 subscriber video for this channel. Back in the olden days, the World of Darkness was published by a small company in Georgia called White Wolf. To keep their most devoted fans apprised of the company and product news, White Wolf published a magazine, appropriately titled White Wolf Magazine. In the June 1994 issue, an article authored by prolific White Wolf and RPG writer Deirdre Brooks was titled The World of Future Darkness. The 10-page article contained suggestions on how to run a setting crossover between the World of Darkness and Cyberpunk 2020. Sounds crazy, I know, but we're gamers because reality is slightly underwhelming, so just roll with it. Cyberpunk 2020, like the World of Darkness, takes place in an alternate reality that is similar to our own in the broad strokes, but different in the details. The gothic punk milieu of Vampire the Masquerade is of a world influenced and shaped by inhuman forces, hiding behind human masks, while man seemingly races to match them in inhumanity to their own kind. Fits surprisingly well with the neon and chrome urban jungles where the weak are prey, both in the streets and in the boardrooms, and humans rush to Ripper docks to cut away their mortal imperfections and frailties, either real or imagined. The powerful are unbound by any sense of noblesse oblige, or even common humanity with those who live beneath them. They are tools, toys, prey, or worst of all, potential rivals. Those outside the halls of power look at their ostensible superiors with resentment and aspire to tear them down, either to take their places or to indulge in an orgy of looting and destruction. Now, I could have been talking about vampires, werewolves, mages, wraiths, or I could have been talking about megacorporations. Take your pick. The big distinction between the World of Darkness and Cyberpunk 2020 is the tech level. Well, let me stop myself. Cyberpunk tech does exist in the World of Darkness. It's just that the Giannis of reality, paradox spirits, get inclined to clean it up for free when some technocrat or etherite breaks the conditioning and tries to show off the cool toys. And the Asamites have been biosculpting people for millennia. It's just that their ideas about aesthetics tend to be a bit, well, unconventional. With all that said, I'm going to review this piece of White Wolf Apocrypha, and then I'm going to deliver my own slant on how vampires of the World of Darkness might function in Cyberpunk 2020. So without further ado, we're chipping in to the World of Future Darkness. If you've watched my previous videos, you should be familiar with at least some of the World of Darkness. Maybe some of you Chumbas also know about Cyberpunk 2020. Maybe not. So let's get you up to speed. In one sentence, Cyberpunk is a game and a genre where high tech meets low lives. It's a future where technology has made life better mainly for those who control it. But those who don't have to scramble for the leftovers. It is a world where people reach for the shining utopia enjoyed by a handful by racing through the dirty, neon-lit streets. Money comes fast and hard, but those who chase it usually end up dying in dark alleys, their remains being picked apart by scavengers. Cyberpunk 2020 is the sequel to Cyberpunk, also known as Cyberpunk 2013, designed by Mike Pondsmith, written by Pondsmith, Colin Fisk, Will Mosk, Scott Ruggles, Dave Friedland, and Mike Bloom, and was published by Art Talsorian Games in 1990. Cyberpunk 2020 is a game of high intensity, where characters live on the bleeding edge and struggle against those who control the world. Your character works hard, plays harder, does everything with style, swagger everywhere they go, and dance right on the edge of life, death, riches, poverty, and madness. This is not a game of deep contemplation or extensive character monologues. If you don't get the bag, someone else will. But who controls the world? The people, to use that term loosely, who own the money, the meals, the movement, the media, and the machines. That would be the corporations. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, technology advanced at a breakneck pace, faster than the wisdom of humans could keep up. Unfortunately, society tends to gather its least wise members in places where they can do the most damage. They tend to call this government. After the various governments of the world collectively shat the bed, resulting in millions and millions and millions and millions of deaths and displacements thanks to a near-total economic collapse, a famine, a nuclear war, and for the main course, a plague of biblical scope. The corporations were the last bastions of stability and safety where the governments had failed. They weren't the ones who broke the world, but they sure haven't done anything to improve it. At least, not unless it helps the bottom line. Meanwhile, down in the gutter, life is cheaper than bullets. Cyberpunks and runners make and end their lives in the neon-saturated streets. There is an entire world that the government would like to ignore, and that the corporations pretend doesn't exist until they need to use it. It is a useful place to recruit disposable people, or dump their failures. The hopeless anesthetize themselves with drugs and alcohol that were originally designed for military use. Booster gangs occupy the lawless parts of cities called combat zones, and will tear apart anyone to get at their Eurodollars, their cybernetics, or just for the thrill of killing. In many instances, the police, whether civil or corporate, are glad to let them have the run of the combat zones, on the understanding that if they head into a mall or corporate area, they'll be eating live fire. Since we've covered some of the punk in Cyberpunk, let's get to the cyber part. Technology in Cyberpunk 2020 is far in advance of what most individuals who aren't technocrats deal with. The saying that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak is a lame excuse. If the flesh is weak, drag your ass to a medtech, or your broke ass to some back alley ripper doc, and get the flesh replaced with cold, hard, merciless steel. Or if you prefer enhanced meat, get some vat-grown bioware installed. Cyberware is not only functional, it is a fashion statement and common enough that you can get cyber surgery done in a mall. But there are downsides to cybernetics. They chew through whatever it is that makes you human, culminating in a condition known as cyberpsychosis, an all-consuming hatred for humans that turns into a desire to murder them. That's when the Psycho Squad hunts you down like an animal. This doesn't stop a rare few humans of exceptionally strong will, or who weren't right in the head to begin with, from becoming full cyborgs, essentially a brain in a jar, usually with a machine gun attached. To even do this, medical tech has advanced pretty far, so much so that it is possible to revive a person from death, assuming that there is enough left of them for the medtechs to work with. A combination of drugs and nanotech can have a cyberpunk back on their feet from wounds that would have been certain death in 2000. Even if after being stabilized, a runner is missing a few parts and doesn't want to embrace steel, it is possible to grow them new limbs and organs, for a steep fee. And then there is body banking. Just like a person can donate organs for the good of their fellow man in our world, in Cyberpunk 2020, a person can do a similar thing, only with their whole body, and for the profit of whoever delivers their remains and donor card to a legitimate donation center for the bounty. Flesh may be weaker than steel, but it is still worth something to the right person. And now to the article. What of the Masquerade in Cyberpunk, the primary raison d'etre of the Camarilla? Well, technology, and cyberware in particular, have made the Masquerade more precarious than ever. People can install thermographic sensors in their eyes. Auditory boosters can hear a vampire's heartbeat, or lack thereof. For vampires with a few layers of protection between themselves and the common edge runner, this is less of a problem than for fledglings and ancilla who have to work for their Eurodollars or blood. While the Masquerade functions, at least for a while, a lot more people suspect that there are things on the streets that are even more unnatural than cyberpsychos. The mecha corporations have been infiltrated by the cat's paws of various clans, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. Eventually, the Masquerade does fail, and as before, the elders will gladly sacrifice vampires of lesser blood to preserve their own unlives. Predictably, the Camarilla responded to potential violations of the Masquerade with demands for more restraint on those they preside over. The brunt of the Camarilla's edicts were borne by the fledglings, Ancilla, and Anarchs. Just as predictably, the Brujah individualist reacted to this about as well as you would expect, gathering disaffected Gangrel, Malkavians, Nosferatu, and Toreador into a faction called the Children of Carthagos. Always with Carthage, you'd think they'd eventually learn. Anyway, the Children of Carthagos seek to breach the Masquerade on their own terms, and create a place of peaceful coexistence between mortals and Cainites. With the more humane and idealist members of the Anarchs abandoning the movement in favor of the Children of Carthagos, the Anarchs took on a harder line, and began to regard mortals as mere kind for them to feed on. The Sabbat were born in chaos, and chaos suits them. In Cyberpunk 2020, the various disasters affecting North America permitted the Sabbat to expand their control over several cities in the former United States, particularly in the south and the west. The escalation of violence by roving packs of Sabbat nomads has gotten them categorized as a booster gang, resulting in several collisions with cyber psycho squads. The Inconnu have seen nothing like the cyberpunk world, but their response is the same as it has always been: discretion and secrecy, even more so now. The number of vampires admitted to the Inconnu has slowed to a trickle as they thoroughly vet their potential members. In an age of nearly unrestrained corporate warfare, the Assamites have more business than ever before. Likewise, conflict between the Camarilla and the Anarchs means that the blood of Cainites is another reward for them to claim, whether elder or fledgling. The world of Cyberpunk teems with rebels, and the Brujah take to such a world like mutated fish in an acidic pond. The iconoclasts are in the streets, most often as solos or rocker boys, riling up conflict with the megacorporations and the law, with words and weapons. The individualists, however, are more successful, as they have a tendency to plan their moves for the greatest effect. A few have even managed to sneak into power with smaller corporations, without spooking the Ventrue or Giovanni. The world of Cyberpunk is a nest of vipers, which means that the followers of Set are right at home. Drugs, sex, and other vices are practically legal under certain regimes, and the Setites have made sure to control the supply of the best designer drugs and the ruthless gangs that sell them. But they make sure to keep to the tall grass for fear of a cybernetic boot crushing their heads. Overland travel in Cyberpunk is perilous in the extreme. This does not deter the Gangrel, who have insinuated themselves among the nomad families for mutual protection. City-dwelling Gangrel usually become solos or medics, which gives them a free pass to move through urban areas unmolested. The Necromancers continue much as they have before. The Mausoleum in Venice is still their base of power, and the Eurodollars continue to flow into their coffers like water. However, their growing strength among the corporations has stepped on the Ventrue's toes one time too many, which means that the Clan of Death may soon find itself in the crosshairs of the Camarilla. In a world that has seemingly gone mad, the Malkavians have prospered greatly, like weeds after a rain. The lunatics can appear almost anywhere in the world of Cyberpunk, and they can do almost anything. The Nosferatu remain a clan apart from both kindred and kind. Their surveillance tools have become even more sophisticated, as have the agents who bring them what they cannot find for themselves. Net-running Nosferatu tend to have more dirt on more people than their predecessors could ever imagine. Like the Gangrel, the Ravnos make their home among the nomads, taking whatever advantage they can of the Gaujo before moving on. The power of the Toreador, within and without the Camarilla, has expanded with their control over the entertainment and media corps. Aside from setting themselves up as the tastemakers of the cyberpunk world, they do their best to patch up holes in the Masquerade, a job that is becoming more trying by the day. In 2020, the Tremere play a delicate balancing game of positioning their mortal servants at the middle levels of corporations controlled by the Ventrue and Giovanni, maintaining influence with both without permitting one to gain too much of an advantage over the other. Some Tremere have noticed that the master of their clan, in his rare moments of lucidity, has seemed more unusual than before. As one might suspect, the Ventrue have managed to stuff their pockets full of corporate toadies, using the classic techniques that have made the clan so powerful, especially with the corporations headquartered in Europe. Given their rarefied feeding needs, it is small wonder that the European Union tends to regard cybernetics as unfashionable. The Caitiff are in the midst of an identity crisis in 2020. Generally, they will side with whoever will take them in, whether mortal gangs, Anarchs, or even Sabbat. Mages are power players in the cyberpunk world. They have had a lot of time to learn subtle maneuverings. For the Order of Hermes, navigating the treacherous world of corporations is less dangerous than the politicking of their tradition. And given the extreme levels of damage that certain weapons in 2020 cause, well, let's say those lightning bolts from nowhere are a lot easier to explain away. Werewolf packs wander the country with the nomad families, some of whom are their own kinfolk. This migratory lifestyle greatly aids them in their attacks on worm-tainted corporations. Netrunners in 2020 whisper to each other about ghosts in the net, haunted mainframes, and data fortresses that have been attacked by things that seem to be immune to ice. The immortal Shem's-Heru are as adaptable as ever and change their ways, just enough to blend into the modern world of cyberpunk. Some have even embraced cyberware and BioWare, though they are the minority, the extreme minority. In 2020, the Society of Leopold has returned to the proper fold of Holy Mother Church. With their cards laid on the table, they have proved to the Pope that vampires exist and hold influence over much of mortal civilization. This led to the Pope arming and funding the Society to a greater extent than ever before, turning the Society into a proper paramilitary force, with enough cyberware and weapons to put them on a near equal footing with any werewolf or vampire. The Special Affairs Division, along with the rest of the US government, has gone to shit. Budget cuts have gutted the division, though current director William T. Burroughs expects that SAD's decline has more to do with vampire interference than government accounting, and has hired edge runners to gather the needed evidence off the books. The NSA has quietly fractured into three factions, one controlled by the Camarilla, another controlled by the Sabbat, and a third which seems eager to identify and locate the vampires controlling the first two. This cold civil war is, as might be expected, a very cloak and dagger game of maneuver and position. The Arcanum persist much as they have before, despite market setbacks such as the disappearance of Jonathan Kelvin, the head of the American section of the Order in 1993. The only clue to this mystery, gleaned by the Arcanum's psychometrists, is that an ancient and powerful presence was in Kelvin's room the night of his disappearance. Kelvin's successor, Thomas Yardley, dislikes the responsibilities of his new office, which takes away time from his field work. And now to the new stuff. The article describes a new bloodline of vampires, exclusive to Night City and the Anarchs, the not quite originally named Cyberpunks. The progenitors of this bloodline are a netrunner named Aaron and a Ravnos Methuselah named Margali. What separates them from their fellows is their new discipline, Technica, which allows them to seize control of machines in their presence. Several edge runners have learned the efficacy of Technica the hard way. For some, it was their last lesson. In addition to Technica, the Cyberpunks demonstrate a proficiency with celerity and potence. However, the bloodline also pays a higher cost for using disciplines, due to their reliance on technology. So, what is Technica? Technica allows cyberpunks to communicate with machines in a way that machines can comprehend. The most basic level of the power allows a cyberpunk to interface with any machine that they can physically touch. At a higher level, the cyberpunk can gain insight into how a piece of tech functions, and can use, repair, or modify it so long as they maintain physical contact. More advanced Technica users can draw on their will to power a device without a traditional power source. Eventually, the need for physical contact becomes unnecessary, and a cyberpunk can interact and interface with machines simply by focusing on them. Masters of the discipline can speak to machines, or possibly the spirit residing within the machine. Exactly what the cyberpunk is communicating with depends on the circumstances. Sometimes it is an actual AI. In other cases, it is the quote-unquote spirit of the object. Depending on the cyberpunk's ability to interpret a machine or spirit's programming or cognition, there is always the potential for, let's say, translation errors between vampire and machine. The highest level of Technica involves casting the vampire's own life force into the machine, granting complete control over it. However, this leaves the cyberpunk's body unattended and vulnerable, meaning that certain steps must be taken to protect it. If a cyberpunk's body is destroyed, they become a ghost, bound to leap from machine to machine forever. In other words, a lesser Alt Cunningham from Cyberpunk 2077. What distinguishes Cyberpunk 2020 from the average World of Darkness chronicle is the presence and prevalence of cyberware. Shiny, shiny and chrome. But it is as much a matter of practicality as it is of fashion. To channel the spirit of one of the great philosophical minds of cyberpunk, Adam Smasher, the simple fact of the matter is that when it comes to meat versus metal, meat wins nearly every time. This brings up a common concern between World of Darkness, specifically Vampire, and Cyberpunk 2020, diminishing humanity. In Vampire, the beast eats a vampire's soul until they become nothing more than a beast themselves. In Cyberpunk 2020, the more cyberware you have, the less human you are likely to become. And when you cross those streams, things get very interesting very quickly. By 2020, there aren't many candidates for the Embrace who don't have at least some cyberware. For some sires, this is a disqualification. Other vampires, more forward-thinking ones, have embraced cyborgs just to see what would happen. Spoiler, the beast and cyberpsychosis are a bad mix. Now, the assumption of the 1994 article is that cyberware, installed while a vampire was still alive, will continue to function after death. Or undeath, rather. Now, there are arguments both for and against this. Narrative-wise and for the sake of effect, I think that the idea of a cybernetic vampire is just cool. But what do you do when you are an elder vampire who was last alive when the most sophisticated level of medical technology were herbs and a sharp knife? Don't worry, you can have cyberware too. Maybe. Those always clever Tremere have figured out a way to temporarily vivify a vampire body for the purpose of installing cybernetics, with a ritual called Awakening the Flesh. If the surgery takes, then congratulations, you are now a cyber vampire. If it doesn't, well, your body forcibly ejecting a pair of new cyber eyes is going to hurt. A lot. And it should go without saying that replacing internal organs on a vampire is a waste of time and money. Matters of the heart are as complicated in vampire surgery as they are in love. It is supposed that the heart could be modified, such as the decentralized heart produced by body weight. On the plus side, a vampire's heart could not be completely destroyed except by some form of catastrophic physical damage. And on the minus side, if a person managed to stake one part of the vampire's decentralized heart, it would paralyze their entire body. Costs and benefits. Could have just learned fortitude. But speaking of fortitude, let's jump to the interaction between cyberware and disciplines. The article discusses the less esoteric disciplines. Auspex does not enhance the sensitivity of cybernetic organs. Aura perception does work as normal as long as the vampire has some kind of usable eyes. But celerity? That's where the real bullshit happens. The example provided is Joe Random Fledgling, embraced with a Sandevistan implant which boosts reflexes and perception to about celerity 3, and the Boost Master enhancement which makes Joe even faster with +1 celerity. Then Joe goes ahead and dumps all those discipline points into celerity for another 3, and finally, to top it off, throw those freebie points onto for 2 more points of celerity, for a grand total of celerity 9. And the short version of celerity 9 is that you are effectively untouchable to anyone with less than celerity 9. You can use yourself as a human-sized bullet to kill people by running straight through them, or you can run on air for short distances. Celerity, in Cyberpunk 2020, is not farity. Moving on to Dominate. Dominate works on cyber optics, whether you are giving or receiving. Now for the complications. Dominate does not affect things like mnemonic or audiovisual recording devices or eidetic chips. Someone with those implants could hit the playback button and realize that their memories have been tampered with, whether or not they know how. Fortitude and Potence only work on the parts of a vampire that are still meat, including bioware. Cyber limbs retain their own strength and vulnerability. With Protean, cyberware makes things more difficult. Every use of a Protean power costs blood to activate, which increases in costs with the level of the power and depending on the body parts in question, such as eyes for gleam of red eyes, cyber arms for claws of the wolf, or form of mist for the entire body. And that's pretty much it for the article. Now there are rules for net running, which is just combat rules with mental stats in computer, and a conversion table for resources in cyberware, which is just TISM. Having run World of Darkness games and Cyberpunk games, I'm a fan of both. The stars have never quite aligned for me for a full-on World of Future Darkness game, though I have snuck the odd vampire and werewolf into Cyberpunk games, purely as the result of cybernetic or biotech lunacy, poser gangs, no Cain or Gaia superstitious nonsense. On the other side, what good is a mage game without at least one hit mark, effectively a Terminator? And forcing technocrats to barter with progenitors for BioWare and other enhancements is just a reminder to the enlightened scientists that, despite being on the same team, they are not one big happy family. But then again, who in the World of Darkness really is? But now, it's my turn. I'm going to inflict just a bit of my own take on the World of Future Darkness on you. Specifically, how I think vampire factions would function in Cyberpunk 2020. The Camarilla. Despite the desires of some of the more staid members of the estate of Cain, the Camarilla, like any good predator, adapted quickly to meet the demands of the changing times. A cohort of forward-thinking princes in Europe recognized the dangers and potential, not in rapidly advancing technology, but in the power that would eventually fall out of the hands of nation-states and into the hands of corporations. A few princes made sure to be in on the ground floor of the EEC, which gave them their in into the later European Union. When the Gang of Four began the quiet war against the EEC economy, the European princes believed it was either an attack on them by their American counterparts or proof of their inability to keep their mortal pawns in America in check. Either way, they decided that it was past time to bring the unruly Americans to heel. They made sure the other side of the Americans' ruinous drug war in Central and South America was well armed, unaware or unconcerned that they were also aiding the Sabbat in the region. When the collapse came in 1994, the first crack in the Camarilla became apparent. A few American princes petitioned the Justicars in the inner circle for support. On the other side of the world, they were building Fortress Europe. More importantly, they were in a somewhat spiteful mood. As far as they were concerned, North America had always been a dumping ground for Sabbat and unruly kindred anyway. The American princes varied between fear and outrage. In the chaos of the economic collapse, their own financial assets were wiped out along with mortals. Some princes fled, others went into torpor, or lost their heads to revolts and coups. Others stood their ground and held on to their positions through some combination of personal power, charisma, cunning, or simple luck. The Anarchs did their level best to make it difficult for them. A few princes of the Midwest and Southeast got organized and agreed to pool resources against the social chaos. By the year 2000, the remaining American princes were fielding small armies of bribed or ghouled mortals to protect them and their domains. Back in Europe, the Camarilla was riding high. Plans were underway to secure their control of the continent, with the finalizing of the Fortress Europe plan, which would mandate secure personal identification and seal the borders of Europe against illegal immigrants. And their military trump card was being finished in orbit, the mass driver, K-Rock on anyone who got too uppity. But the turn of the century dumped a series of problems in their lap. First was the wasting plague, which killed millions in Europe and, less importantly, America. Fortunately, bioweapons labs in Brandenburg quickly developed a cure and distributed it to the livestock, people, through a corporation that had previously done its best to avoid publicity, the Ossenfelder Group. Ossenfelder was the brainchild of two princes, a Malkavian and a Ventrue, to shield the Camarilla from public scrutiny through generous use of laws protecting corporate secrecy and organization. Through Ossenfelder and its holdings, the Camarilla could act practically in plain sight and with little legal scrutiny. Most importantly, the Ossenfelder Group would act as a substitute for the clandestine feudalism of the Camarilla. The vision of Ossenfelder was to make every Camarilla vampire a shareholder employee of the corporation, to eliminate the squabbling for domain and the more self-destructive politicking of the sect, and to set up a system for supplying its membership with a steady supply of cloned human blood, should the Masquerade finally fail and mortals react poorly. Ossenfelder also flexed its muscles against members of the Camarilla who would not go along with their enlightened plan. Princes who resisted the Ossenfelder group too vocally found their security systems disabled during the day, just enough time for them to disappear without a trace. When discretion wasn't required, Ossenfelder security services, armed with cutting-edge weapons and cybernetic enhancements, simply eliminated any threats through superior force. Back in the US, the American Camarilla had weathered much of the storm of the collapse, despite states seceding and asserting their independence and a loss of territory in the West. Then came news from the Southwest that war packs of Sabbat were coming out of Mexico, well-trained and heavily armed. They had rolled over the Anarchs in Southern California, slogged their way through Texas, and fought a brutal siege in Las Vegas before ritualistically flaying and dismembering every kindred who remained in the city. Once again, some of the princes reached across the Atlantic for help and were met with deafening silence. The princes of Kansas City, Chicago, Minneapolis, Memphis, and Denver held an emergency conclave in 2015 and decided that they would throw everything they had at the Sabbat in Colorado Springs. In the ruins of Colorado Springs, the American Camarilla laid a series of traps for the Sabbat, doing their best to obscure only the last one, a series of firebombs laid to force the Sabbat into open battle rather than their preferred guerrilla encirclements. The casualties were high, but by the time the Sabbat retreated, the Camarilla had lost nearly half of its numbers, and the princes of Minneapolis and St. Louis had met final death. The combined force of vampires pursued the Sabbat nearly as far as Las Vegas, before growing worried that they were being led into a trap themselves. The American Camarilla, by now fully disgusted with the lack of support from Europe, hastily signed onto the Denver Compact, naming 3 kindred who had distinguished themselves in the Battle of Colorado Springs as their Justicars, and sending a message to the Inner Circle that while they would continue to uphold the traditions, they no longer considered the Inner Circle or any of its functionaries as having any legitimate authority over them, effectively telling them to fuck off now and forever. We're going to make our own Camarilla, with blackjack and hookers. Several other princes from the South and Southeast signed on to the compact later, most notably New Orleans, Raleigh, and Lexington. The reaction from Europe was once again disturbingly quiet. A few Justicars wanted to go put the compact princes in their place, preferably by staking them and leaving them for the sun. But the Inner Circle, advised by the Ossenfelder group, was not particularly distressed. The Ossenfelder group was already in Night City. They had helped push the mob out and were planning their own corporate complex. In time, they would deal with them all: Compact, Anarchs, and Sabbat. The Camarilla are the lords of all of Cain's children, whether they like it or not. The Sabbat. In 1990, the United States went to war in Central America. It was a war that caught the Sabbat off guard, but they quickly adjusted. Those who saw the hand of the Camarilla at work threw themselves into the crucible of war, and they were reborn, along with those who would follow them. The war had created hundreds and thousands of veterans, battle-tested, and whose morals were compromised, ready to be inducted into the Sword of Cain, under the auspices of a pact controlling a small drug cartel in the south of Mexico, La Liga de la Sangre. It took a lot of time and Valdery, but La Liga expanded from 7 Cainites to over 200. They terrorized Central and South America while the world came apart at the seams. Later, members of La Liga gathered together and traveled into the collapsing South American continent, an 8-year journey that would later be known as La Romería, the pilgrimage. While they were in South America, La Liga developed its own theology, cobbled together from pieces of Nahdism, Catholicism, Regla Lucumi, and Nahua practices. They also perfected their martial discipline against humans, lupines, and even stranger creatures. In 1999, La Liga de la Sangre returned to Mexico to reclaim their former domain in Chiapas. Once they brutalized, skinned, and exsanguinated the mortals and vampires who squatted in their territory, they moved north, seizing drug routes as they went until they hit the border. Then, it was a simple matter of transporting newer and more potent synthetic drugs into the American, European, and African markets, cooked up in their secret labs hidden in the jungles. The Fourth Sabbat Civil War began in 2006, when the regent was exposed as a fraud. Following the execution of the assassin pretender Sikorsky, a struggle began over the succession that quickly devolved into open bloodshed. The La Sombra charged the Tzimisce with treachery and insinuated that they had arranged Regent Galbraith's death to replace her with one of their own. By the time the last head fell in 2011, the Black Hand was nearly in ruins, and a La Sombra named Rogelio Juvenal Serrano assumed the regency, with the help of La Liga de la Sangre. The grateful regent immediately granted them two cardinalates, the new Cardinal of the Western Territories, Petronila la Amada, and the Cardinal of Chiapas, the founder of La Liga de la Sangre, a vampire known to his disciples and enemies only as El Padrino. With the Sabbat attempting to recover their strength, La Liga became the dominant military power of the Sabbat. In 2015, they launched a crusade on the United States. The Sabbat toppled several Camarilla and Anarch domains before their war parties were halted at Colorado Springs. Despite the setback, the Sabbat's territory has expanded significantly, and to the delight of the ultra-conservatives and status quo, La Liga seems willing to fight for the Sabbat, provide money and discipline soldiers for the cause, so long as their drug trafficking and bloody rights go unquestioned. But the Loyalists and the Black Hand fear La Liga de la Sangre, and not without cause. They suspect that La Liga will dispense with their seeming indifference to Sabbat politics and tear the sect apart once it is no longer useful to them, or worse, they will stay in the Sabbat and remove its soul, reducing the Sword of Cain to mere drug traffickers and narco-terrorists. The Inquisition is disturbed, not by their penchant for ritualistic and very public displays of torture, mutilation, and mayhem, but the rumors that La Liga appears to revere beings other than Cain. Outside of the Sabbat, law enforcement agencies in the Free States, the new United States, the European Union, and the Pan-African Alliance have become aware of an especially brutal drug trafficking organization they have identified as the Chiapas Cartel. All attempts to infiltrate the organization have resulted in the disappearance or death of agents and informants alike. Among the Camarilla, only Marlene Mayer, the Justicar of Clan Tremere, believes that there is a link between the Chiapas Cartel and the Sabbat. The Anarchs. As America declined, the Anarchs rode the wave of upheaval to expand the Anarch Free States. They pushed out of California, north into Canada, and west into the border of Louisiana. The liberation of Houston, as the Anarchs called it, was the high watermark of the Anarch movement in the late 1990s, on par with the capture of Los Angeles nearly 40 years earlier. Dallas only held thanks to the presence of the Tremere regent and counselor, Mirlinda. The Anarchs did their best to ignore the rest of the collapse, at least at first. As the dead piled higher, a few wiser Anarchs realized that the mobs that had helped them could just as easily turn against them, and began efforts to relieve the starvation and poverty that was sweeping the country. Anarchs from Europe were also fleeing to the United States, rather than the other way around. They relayed that they were being systematically eradicated by enhanced mortals in the employ of some corporation called the Ossenfelder Group. When the news of the Fortress Europe plan came out, the Anarchs realized who was likely behind the attacks on their comrades, the Camarilla. But the Free Staters had bigger fish to fry, specifically how to govern all of their newly won territory without falling into the poorly defensible gangster feudalism that had plagued them in California. While this state of affairs was fine for some, more reasonable Anarchs argued that they needed a better system, or they would likely be swept aside by a better organized force, whether it was the Camarilla or someone else. In 2011, the Anarchs held a meeting in Las Vegas to determine if it was even possible to set wide-ranging goals for the Anarch movement. Naturally, it wasn't. The Sin City Congress was more noted for the havoc unruly Anarchs wreaked on the Strip than for actually accomplishing anything. In 2015, the Anarchs faced the full weight of a Sabbat crusade, for which they were unprepared, thanks to nearly a decade of squabbling. The taking of Los Angeles struck the Anarchs like a lightning bolt. They weren't fighting shovelheads. They were fighting soldiers, hardened killers without humanity. And those were just the mortals. The Cainites managed to be worse. Despite attempts to organize a counteroffensive, the Anarchs were pushed back. Only Houston held the line, and that came with a permanent Sabbat presence in the city. Defeated Anarchs fled north, some hunkering down in Night City, but others went all the way to Seattle and bloated the city's kindred population to nearly unmanageable numbers. The Anarchs of Houston are probably the best equipped and organized domain in the Free States. Night City serves as a staging ground for their efforts to reclaim Los Angeles from the Sabbat, though the Anarchs have to watch their step with so many competing players in the corporate city by the bay. The Assamites. Alamut has fallen. The Mideast meltdown ripped out the clan's heart, along with destroying most of the region. Those who were away from the Eagle's Nest have since received no word from the eldest nor any Rafiki in the region. This made the Assamites more vulnerable and more dangerous. Some Assamites sought sanctuary with the Sabbat, where the anti-tribu had made a place for themselves within the Black Hand. The Assamites who were undercover remained in place, but the Ossenfelder group extended an offer to those assassins and viziers it considered to be reasonable. They would join the organization, keep most of their own traditions, in exchange for their particular sets of skills. This arrangement proved so mutually beneficial for 20 years that the inner circle of the Camarilla is considering a list of names for the first Assamite Justicar to be named at the next conclave. But a few Assamites managed to pick their way across the irradiated hellscape to the ruins of Alamut and discovered something that sent them fleeing back to safety in Europe. Demons of plague and radiation had taken up residence in Hakim's sanctuary. The followers of Set. The Setites were not as affected by the meltdown as the Assamites. After all, is not Set the god of chaos and war? Despite the damage suffered by Egypt, there were opportunities aplenty for the serpents to coil themselves around. The return of the nomadic tribalism and warlords meant that the Setites could bring some of their rights into the open. The economic and military alliance between Tanzania and the European Union was a prime opportunity for the Setites to get their own pawns involved in the Pan-African side of the Space Alliance, though it did require significant bribing, blackmailing, and flattering of the Gahuri kings of the Libon, who knew from experience that one does not trust a serpent that still has venom in its fangs. Fortress Europe also presented certain difficulties for the Setites. However, the Scandinavian branch of the clan is doing booming business when it comes to peddling corruption into Europe. Given their liberal attitudes towards most vices save for combat drugs, the Setites take advantage of this to smuggle synthetic drugs, illegal braindance chips, and play beings around the world, filling the clan's accounts with Eurodollars. And America? America is truly the land of opportunity for the followers of Set. 200 million people who just want to get ahead, get high, or get fucked in no particular order. But most importantly, they are desperate and in need of purpose. Purpose which Set will gladly provide. Their major problem in America is that the Camarilla, Sabbat, and Anarchs are all extremely trigger happy, and the Setites, for now, are fine with just staying out of their way. The Giovanni. There's no business like the family business, and the family business is good. The Giovanni have their fingers in more pies than ever before, and are more dangerous than the Camarilla realizes. The Giovanni have purchased Venice and the surrounding areas outright, and turned it into a privately owned city, floating on the water. While preserving much of the city's classic architecture and tourism dollars from Europe, the Giovanni have also built another city beneath its facade, an economic and military juggernaut that the world has only seen a fraction of. The Giovanni family runs perhaps the most secure financial services corporation in the world. Netrunners who have tried to penetrate their systems have either been fried or come back very, very wrong. With the Giovanni, your money is completely secure, though they don't like to be questioned as to how they do it. In addition to high finance, the Giovanni field some of the most brutal military forces on Earth, the Nemissaries. The Nemissaries are an unusual mixture of apparent humans, cyborgs, and automated weapon systems. In one of the most unusual plays, the Giovanni have also heavily invested in biomedical sciences and lobbied hard against the creation of sentient human clones. The secret of the Giovanni's success is the same as it has always been, a combination of ruthless intelligence, secrecy, and necromancy. Their most skilled and trusted Wraith servants become Nemissaries, inhabiting the specially prepared war bodies and androids constructed by the clan. Lesser Wraiths are chained to the Giovanni's data fortresses in the net, a force that cannot be overcome with computer programs. A slave army numbering in the millions, all compelled by necromancy, to protect their master's secrets or face oblivion. The clan's presence in the United States has been far more stable than the Camarillas. After all, family is family. The ambitious were busy collecting the souls of those who died in the collapse and then during the wasting plague. And it was an American Giovanni who developed the idea of necrotech, a combination of cybernetics and necromancy that could make Zombu more effective, which was later refined into the Nemissary program. The Ravnos. Okay, here's where I would do something about the Ravnos, but honestly, who cares? Something nomads. There. Okay, fine. The Ravnos. Thanks to the Ravnos' nomadic existence, they were ahead of the curve when the collapse came. Their companions were already on the roads as the unemployed, homeless, starving masses of America tried to escape from the cities and failed farms to survive. Ravnos and their mortal family members picked entire towns and cities clean in the chaos of the 1990s. This only made them more loathsome to the kindred who were trying to keep order there. Through casual exchange and temporary alliances, the Ravnos influenced and infiltrated the forming nomad nations, preferring to have a hand in everyone's pockets instead of relying on just one. There are even some Ravnos who align themselves with the despised Rafin Shiv, the scum of the nomad nations, just to keep things interesting. Of course, the Ravnos avoid fighting one another and stay in contact through a secret and informal network they call the Black Blood. Over in Europe, the Ravnos have had a much more difficult time of things, thanks to the Fortress Europe plan. The Camarilla has, unofficially, made it known to the Ravnos that if any one of them take a step into continental Western Europe, their remaining knights would be counted on one hand. Ossenfelder security services made good on this threat when a few bravely stupid Shilmulo decided to test it. However, some Ravnos do manage to get in through Greece, fleece as many Gaujos as they can, and get back out before they are discovered. The Society of Leopold. The preeminent hunters of vampires have dealt with internal dissension on two fronts. The first is policy. The Society has been more liberal than the Roman Catholic Church in some ways, notably on its policies on female inquisitors. But more pious inquisitors regard the Vatican III reforms as a bridge too far. Some hunters have sided with Cardinal Lewandowski and his schismatic Church of Poland. Others have begun arguing in favor of sedevacantism. On the other hand, church membership and incomes have increased, and she has taken a far more militant stance on protecting her flock around the world. The Swiss Guard, once more ceremonial than practical, has, in 30 years, become an effective and dangerous force in the Vatican service, and the Society has inducted several of these dedicated soldiers of God into the fight against the forces of hell. But that debate is far more academic and much calmer than the one over the use of cybernetics. Traditionalist hunters believe cybernetics are an abomination, and their greatest evidence of this is the condition of cyberpsychosis. Others, specifically within the Gladius Dei and the Condottieri, argue that cybernetics and certain forms of bioware have effectively put them on equal footing with the enemy. At least 3 inquisitors, maimed beyond repair in autos de fe, have been converted into full cyborgs and show no signs of psychosis. If anything, they are more faithful and more effective than could ever have been hoped as mere flesh. In a rather solemnic splitting of the baby, the Inquisitor General has stated that the Society will not reject recruits with cybernetics out of hand, nor will it deny members access to augmentations for legitimate medical purposes, but it will not allow optional or cosmetic cybernetic enhancements. Thanks to the Society's larger war chest, it does have another option: powered armor. The Society has a contract with a Hungarian manufacturer owned by a family of weaponsmiths and armorers who have served the Society since the 17th century, giving them access to custom-designed powered armor specifically suited to the Society's needs, something that their targets have learned the hard way, as high-tech Crusader suits crashed into their havens, hurling lances of flames like God's own punishing angels. And that was the World of Future Darkness, along with my ideas on a crossover between Vampire and Cyberpunk 2020. These are 2 games that I really like, even though I've said it before, though it's been my experience that they have similar themes when it comes to alienation, conflict, and humanity, though style of play tends to be different, and is usually encouraged to be. Certain players of Vampire tend to look down their noses at high-action games, overgeneralizing them as trenchcoats and katanas or supers with fangs. Meanwhile, Cyberpunk's first story, Never Fade Away, involves you and the fellas shooting your way into a mega corporation's fortified tower to rescue your hacker princess. And if you've played Cyberpunk 2013 or that other game, you know how that worked out. A World of Future Darkness would be a game where vampires would have to adapt to a situation where technology has not only put humanity as a collective, but individual humans on par with, or in some cases, superior to, supernaturals. For the most part, humans are still humans, no matter what trinkets or toys they have. Vampires still hold the top trump card. They can outlast most of their enemies. Even the great Salvador Arasaka, for all of his power, did everything he could to avoid going the way of all flesh. Though having amassed negative karma well in excess of his fortune, he would likely be a prime candidate to draw the second breath. Whether as a child or as a ghoul, immortality, even of the nocturnal sort, may be too tempting an offer for the rulers of the world to turn down. If you're interested in another take on it, Janus Games published a whole slew of unofficial, licensed, alternate reality cyberpunk books that covered vampires, werewolves, and other creatures that go bump in the night as the products of biological, cybernetic, or psychic shenanigans. Anyway, that's all I have for now. Thanks for listening, and a big thanks to you fantastic 5,000 subscribers who, for whatever your reasons, enjoy listening to me chatter about a nearly 30-year-old role-playing game. Until next time.